So hi, everybody, and welcome to our third and final class of Unlocking the Haggadah, a three-part online learning series in preparation for Pesach with Pardes faculty. Today, we are honored to be learning with Dr. David Bernstein. David is the Dean Emeritus of Pardes. He holds a BA and MA in history and a PhD in religious education from New York University. He also attended Yeshivat Hamivtar. David has been the Dean of Pardes since 1998. Previously, he was the director of Midreshet Lindenbaum, popularly known as Bravenders, for 12 years. David was a Jerusalem Fellow at the Mandel School for Jewish Education in Jerusalem, and he takes many adult and student groups on Jewish heritage trips to Poland, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, and Berlin. He came back recently from a trip to Poland, and we're especially honored to be learning with him today because today is his birthday. I hope it's okay that I share that with everybody, but thank you so much, Dean Bernstein, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks, Jordan, and thanks to all of you who are here. It's nice to see some very familiar faces and nice to see some new faces as well. So let me start out by saying that the Seder is the quintessential Jewish experience. It is the ideal meal. If we try to imagine a Shabbat meal, if we try to imagine a Jewish simcha, it's the ideal meal. It's eating in fellowship. It's eating with family, with friends. It's filled with content and meaning and with singing. And no wonder. It is the most widely observed Jewish holiday ritual. Every poll that they take, whether it's in Israel or any country in the diaspora, shows that more Jews are participating in a Pesach Seder than just about any other Jewish holiday ritual. And so I'm going to assume that everybody here has been to at least one Seder. And what I'd like to do is ask for you to write in the chat in 1 to 4 words, what made your best Seder experience? What were the elements in 4 words or less, could be 1 word, that made your Seder experience a terrific one, the one that you're thinking about, or more than one that you're thinking about? Great, so I'm seeing making the story relevant. Very important. Great shared conversations and singing. Absolutely. Kids' conversation. Family participation. Uproarious laughter. Yeah, the Seder should be fun. It should be a learning experience. I'm going to talk about that. A learning experience, I don't only mean cognitive, also mean affective or emotional. But yeah, it should be fun. Singing, family and warmth, good discussion. Magid lasting for hours. Okay. Some people would say that's not what made it great, but some people would say that did make it great. Short, the opposite. Home. Interaction, great. Thought-provoking discussion, lots of laughs, good. Childhood with my grandparents, yeah. Welcoming a surprise guest. Camping with family and participating in a Seder with other campers. My cousin telling me her 14-year-old daughter thought our Seder was cool. 3 generations of family, beautiful, beautiful, really. We have it right there. Those are the elements that make a great Seder. So I'm going to try to point out some things that come from an educational lens. And again, I want to stress when I say education, I don't only mean of the mind, I mean of the heart as well. Because I think as I get older, that the emotional, the heart, is probably at least as important as the mind. And so I'm saying that both of these are very important. So I want to quote one of the great professors of education of the 20th century in America, Professor Joseph Schwab of Harvard University, who described 4 commonplaces in any educational setting. And I believe that at its heart, this is what the Seder ought to include. First of all, there's content. Second of all, there's the student. And then there's the teacher, let's call it the leader of the Seder. There might be more than one leader of the Seder. And the milieu, the cultural context. And trying to adapt Professor Schwab's understanding of those 4 commonplaces of any educational, any learning endeavor. So the content here would obviously be the Haggadah. That's the content. And more broadly, the story of the Exodus. The student, of course, students are the participants in the program. And here again, saying students and teachers is a little bit hierarchical at most Seders, but nonetheless, I'm saying all the participants in the Seders, Seder. The teacher could be the leader or leaders of the Seder. And the milieu, the cultural context, also has to be taken into account. There are some Sederim where there's a very important emphasis on halakha, on doing things exactly the right way according to Jewish law. And then there are others that are a little bit more liberal in their understanding. And just as an example, that milieu is very important for us to understand if we want to be able to have an effective learning experience. You have to know who you are. If you're leading or an active participant in the Seder, you have to know the content, the Haggadah, and you have to know the audience. The audience, what he would call the students, but it could be peers, and that's very important. Is it an adult Seder, or are there children at the Seder? And if so, what are their ages, and how to involve them on a level that they can understand and participate in? If anybody here is going to have children at their Seder, I highly recommend you feed them for the Seder. In fact, for some people, the adults need that too. For our grandkids, my wife usually uses Lego people to create scenes from the Exodus from Egypt, the splitting of the Red Sea, etc. And of course, you can activate the students, the children, to be doing that themselves. Give them the equipment and say, okay, now make this scene, make the scene of this plague, make the scene of this, of the splitting of the Red Sea. Like almost anything worthwhile in life, a Seder needs preparation. I just sent out this morning to our family that's coming to the Seder that we expect everyone to come with a vort, with something to say, a short vort about something in the Haggadah or related to the Haggadah or related to the story of the Exodus, and that includes children. Some people assign parts of the Haggadah in advance and say, okay, you prepare something on the 4 questions and you prepare something on the 10 plagues. But I think that that's a very important part of or let's say it adds tremendously. I think it creates involvement and buy-in from the beginning. There is a beautiful custom that on Shabbat Gadol, which is this Shabbat, the Shabbat preceding Passover, that the custom is to read through the Haggadah. And it's a great way for anyone who's participating in a Seder to prepare. Depending on the audience, you may want to ask everybody to bring their own Haggadah, because people might have their favorite Haggadah. And if you have a variety of Haggadot, you'll have a variety of commentaries and insights. On the other hand, if your audience is people who are more learning about Judaism, then it might pay to have one standard Haggadah so that everybody can be on the same page. And you can say, okay, we're now on page 12, and everybody knows where we are and doesn't lose the place. So again, you have to know your audience with that. Of course, if you have an audience that's mixed, so you can mix it that way, and you can have the people who are less familiar with the Haggadah have a standard edition of the Haggadah that's provided. And then for the people who are more advanced, they can have their own favorite Haggadah. Shira Hecht Kohler has a webinar on the Hadran website, and she had an interesting suggestion that people bring a photograph that represents freedom or bondage or another Seder theme. I would add to that, you can bring a quote or an anecdote about something about freedom or slavery or some other Seder theme. She also had another suggestion about, quote, putting yourself in the story. And what she meant by that was that every person in advance of the Seder should write a diary entry as if they are coming out of Mitzrayim. And that diary entry could be something that is from a typical Jew who's leaving Egypt, or it could be from one of the characters mentioned in the story. It could be from Moshe, from Aaron, from Miriam. It could be from Yocheved, Miriam and Aaron and Moshe's mother. So I think that's another idea, putting yourself in the story. Of course, you can also make a Seder around a theme. Colors in the Seder, water in the Seder, sense and senses in the Seder. So before we go on, I'd like to ask you to go to the chat again. And if you have a favorite Haggadah, or if you have a Haggadah to recommend that you think would be worthwhile other people look into, so why don't you put it in the chat? Wow, there's so many different Haggadahs. Yeah, I'm familiar with some of them, not all of them, but absolutely, these are all great suggestions. Illuminated Haggadot with pictures are also a conversation piece. Great. Great, terrific. This is the Jonathan Sachs Haggadah, one of my favorites, but I use a different one usually every year. Another one is the one by Erica Brown, the Conversational Haggadah. So these are all, I think, great choices. And if any of you see anything here that interests you, maybe there's still time to get that Haggadah as well. Okay, so one more thing I want to talk about before we get into the Haggadah itself and some sharing of some Vortlach or little Divrei Torah is about pace, the pace of the Haggadah. And here I'm especially saying it if you're a leader or one of the leaders of the Haggadah, of the Seder. On the one hand, we all want to hear, we want everybody to participate, we want everybody to share. On the other hand, practically, people get hungry, and the Seder needs to move along. Halachically, the afikoman is supposed to be eaten before chatzot. So everyone needs to find the balance between those things. I know where my balance lies generally, but that's not relevant at this point. I want to hand it over to Jordan just for a very brief hint about some upcoming events, and then we'll come back.
So we're doing a commercial break now so that folks can leave right when the shiur is over. If you know already that you want to continue learning with David Bernstein, we have a really exciting opportunity coming up on Yom HaZikaron on April 25th. It's a virtual walking tour of Har Herzl with him in conjunction with Lincoln Square Synagogue. And everything I'm sharing now, I'll send out in a follow-up email after the shiur as well. We have the Legacy Learning Series. That is a monthly online learning series featuring legacy Pardes faculty members in honor of the 50th anniversary. On May 9th, Leah Rosenthal is teaching a class entitled An Intimate Conversation with God. And another thing coming up on May 9th is the beginning of our Machloket Matters Fellowship Spring Cohorts. This is a fellowship run by Pardes North America focused on Machloket L'Shem Shamayim, or constructive disagreement. And we have various cohorts coming up that we are recruiting for right now. Again, they begin May 9th. So I'll share all of this in a follow-up email and passing it back to you, David.
Okay, thank you, Jordan. So we start with Kiddush. Actually, many people start with reciting the 15 steps, Kadesh or Chatz, the stages of the Seder, and it even has a tune that goes along with it. So many people do that. But then the first stage, the first step in the Seder, in the order, is Kiddush. And Kiddush is something that people are familiar with, generally from Shabbat or other holidays. And my own practice, and that's really what I'm going to do here, is share some of my own practices. Hopefully that will get you to think of other things for yourself, is that when everybody is getting ready for Kiddush and standing, and if you stand, some have the custom of sitting, I'm standing there and I'm holding the cup of wine, but before I start, I remind everybody that we're about to engage in a ritual that is probably almost 3,000 years old, and that there are very few peoples on the planet that can participate in such an ancient ritual, and one that has survived through the chain of Jewish history for so long, or of any history. Most of the rituals of peoples 2,000 and 3,000 years ago are gone. Most of those peoples are gone. Perhaps in the culture of India, perhaps in the civilization of China, they have something similar to this. I don't know. But I think in Western society, this is probably the oldest continuous ritual, religious ritual that people observe. And I think that that's very powerful. And the fact that the vast majority of Jews participate in it today as well is just amazing to me. And so I think I like to take that moment just to remind everybody that it's not just our family. It goes back thousands of years. It's not just something from 2023 that we're doing. We're actually tying ourselves to a very, very long chain of Jewish history. In Urchatz, where we wash without a blessing, so right away, it begs the question, wait a minute, this is not what we usually do on a Friday night. It's not what we usually do on a holiday. Usually after Kiddush, we wash with a blessing and we go to the Motzi right away. So right away is pointing to the fact that this is going to be different. And the reason that we wash is that in temple times, it was customary to wash before eating vegetables because there were concerns about purity and impurity that we don't live with today. And this too ties us back to Jewish communities thousands of years ago. And I like to call it the vertical connection in Jewish history. But there's also a horizontal connection in that we know that all around us, there are other Jews, families and Jewish friends, groups of friends who are celebrating Pesach at the Seder, just as we are. So again, it's a connection point to Jewish history in the past and to Jews all over the world today. I don't know whether this was true in your communities, but I know here in Israel, in the middle of the Seder at a certain time, everybody got out on their porches or in front of their doors and started to applaud for the medical teams that were working so hard. And it was a moment. It was really a moment. And you understood that everybody around you was doing this. We move on to Karpas. Passover is the holiday of spring. Chag HaAviv is what it's called at times in the Torah. And it must always fall in the spring. The Jewish calendar creates a leap year to be sure that it always stays in the spring and doesn't move in our lunar calendar. And that's why we eat something green, something that reflects spring. Yes, I know many of us eat potatoes. That probably is due to our East European ancestry. But parsley or something green. Of course, spring is a time of rebirth. It's a rebirth in nature. And of course, this is the time of the birth of the Jewish people. And what we do with the karpas is we dip it. We dip it in salt water or vinegar to remind us of the tears or the bitterness of slavery. And Rabbi Sachs points out that there are two dippings in the Pesach Seder. One is that karpas, we take, let's say, parsley or a potato and dip it in salt water. And later, we're going to take the maror, the bitter herbs, and dip that in the charoset, which is sweet. And he says this is parallel to the two dippings mentioned in the Torah that are connected to the story of the Jewish descent into Egypt and the Jews leaving Egypt. The descent into Egypt begins with the Joseph story. And if you remember, when the brothers sell Joseph, they come back to their father, Jacob, with his many-colored coat, and they've dipped it in blood. And that's the beginning of the story of how the Jews came down to Egypt. And Rabbi Sachs points out, I think quite insightfully, that what we're doing is we're taking something sweet and we're making it either salty or bitter, because that's the beginning of the story of our bondage. On the other hand, the second dipping, where we take the maror, something bitter, and dip it in charoset to make it sweet, that's parallel to the second dipping in the Egypt story, when the Jews take a hyssop, they take, let's call it parsley, it's really hyssop, but let's call it parsley, and they dip it in blood and put it on their doorposts, right, for the last plague. And it's a sign of defiance for the Egyptians. They're identifying their own homes. They're saying they're not afraid, that they know they'll be protected. And it's the beginning of the redemption of the Jews for leaving Egypt, because it's that night that they'll be leaving Egypt. So the dippings have their parallels as well. The dippings of the Seder have parallels into the story of the descent and the leaving of Egypt. We then move on to Yachatz, where we break the middle matzah. And it's a little bit strange why we have 3 matzot to begin with, because normally at a Shabbat table, we would have 2 chalot. Normally at a holiday table, we would have 2 chalot, so we should have 2 matzot. But the third matzah is what makes Pesach unique, and it reflects the special mitzvah, the special commandment to eat the matzah on the Seder night. And we break it into two. And why do we break it into two? There are numerous explanations. One of them, which Rabbi Sachs gives, and I haven't seen elsewhere, is that it reflects the fact that there's a dual nature of the matzah itself. We break it into two pieces because matzah is at once the bread of affliction, the bread of poverty, and on the other hand, it's the bread of freedom. It represents our freedom. That's what the Jews ate when they left Egypt. And it's both of those things at the same time. And they're in a dialectical tension. And he said, this is why we break it into two pieces, to show there are two aspects to the matzah. The other explanation, which he gives or many other people give, is that if it's the bread of affliction, if it's the bread of poverty, a poor person who doesn't have enough food doesn't eat everything all at once. A poor person who doesn't have enough food has to put aside some food for later on because they literally don't know where their next meal is coming from. This, of course, echoes in recent Jewish history, the Shoah, but it echoes poverty in general and bondage in general, that you don't know where your next meal is coming from, and therefore you have to set some aside because you're going to be hungry later on. If you eat it all now, what are you going to eat later in the day? Halachma Anya, we begin Magid, we begin the largest part of the Haggadah, where we are going to tell the story, and also the rabbis will bring all sorts of midrashim, all sorts of interpretations about the story of the Exodus. And during that Magid, we begin with Halachma Anya, this is the bread of affliction, and we point to the matzah, or we raise the matzah so everybody can see it. But Halachma Anya ends with everybody who's hungry should come and eat with us. I don't know too many people who open their doors at this part of the Seder and invite strangers in. I don't even know so many people who really invite strangers to their Seder. It's usually family and friends. Certainly a big mitzvah to invite people who don't have another place to go, for sure. But you know, in halachic terms, the way that we fulfill this commandment, or this idea to share with others, is by giving charity before Pesach to people or organizations that will help people to be able to make the Passover holiday. And that's an important thing to do as well in preparation for the Seder, is to make sure that other people have the ability to make the Seder, and in that way, we are including them in our Seder as well. But the whole idea that we are inviting others or helping others by making a donation to make their Seder, that's the perspective of a free person. That's the perspective of somebody who has some means. A slave can't do that. A slave doesn't have the means to be able to share their food. Their food is so limited. It's another sign of our freedom. So even though it's the bread of affliction, that paragraph ends with, we are free people because we are sharing, and we are opening our homes or opening our wallets so that other people can also have a Pesach Seder. The whole section of Magid moves from what we call Genai to Shevach, from slavery to freedom, from idolatry to ethical monotheism. And here I want to cite, he doesn't write about it in his Haggadah, but Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, may he rest in peace, we all miss him very much. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs was once asked by the BBC on the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. He was asked to do a documentary about Auschwitz. And Rabbi Sachs said, I'll do it, but only if I can do it in a Jewish way. Okay, they didn't really understand what he meant. But here's what he did. He spent the longest part of the documentary talking about the history of Auschwitz, the suffering of the Jewish people, the suffering of other peoples in Auschwitz. And he ended the last few minutes with scenes from children playing in the streets of Jerusalem. Because what Rabbi said, the message he wanted to give was the Jewish way is that we remember the despair, we remember the suffering, we don't forget it, but we end with hope, and we end with celebration. And that's what we do with the Seder as well. We move on to the story of the 5 rabbis in Bnei Brak, who are so involved in the Passover Seder and telling the stories that it's already time for the morning prayers. And I find that story to be very leveling, because here are 5 of the great rabbis of the Mishnah, and they are telling the story of the Seder, and we are telling the story of the Seder. And we join that very long chain of Jews, learned and not so learned, even illiterate, who told the story for millennia, not centuries, but millennia. We join Jews all over the world today, highly learned rabbis and Jews who've never learned Torah, in retelling the story. And in that way, I find that to be very leveling. It's incumbent upon all Jews, even if you know the story, even if you're very learned, it's incumbent on you to do it as if you're hearing it for the first time, as if you're illiterate, as if you don't know very much Torah. But that's the story of the 5 rabbis. In Magid, there are various opportunities to sing, and hopefully, at your Seder, you'll also be able to sing. During Magid, I like to go around the table asking everyone to read. Everybody reads a paragraph. Those people who want to read in Hebrew can do that. Those people who prefer to read in English can do that. But to me, that's another way to involve people, not only in discussions, but in the reading itself, so they're not hearing the same voices. Bracha will come to questions at the end. The 4 sons, or the 4 children, if you like. The Judaica artist David Moss, full disclosure, a friend and neighbor, made a beautiful Haggadah known as the Moss Haggadah. You can look at it online, or you can buy it. I think it costs $10,000. There's also a coffee table edition that sells for, I think, $150. Graphically, he represents the 4 children as playing cards. Like a jack, a queen, a king. He represents them as playing cards. And he writes in the commentary that much as we as parents think that we have influence over our children, we have to realize that we're dealt a hand. And our job as parents is to make the best of the hand that we're given. And of course, this is true certainly with children who are limited by physical challenges or emotional challenges or mental challenges. But it's true even in children that are quote unquote normal and don't have those obvious challenges, but children are children, they're people. And if you have more than one child, and if you have more than one sibling, if you have any siblings, you know that siblings are different, children are different. And being a parent means playing that hand as best you can. Maybe the 2 parents are the same, but the children are always different. We come to V'hi Sha'amda, which is often sung. And V'hi Sha'amda, reads in English, and this promise is what has stood by our ancestors and us. For it was not only one man who rose up to destroy us. In every single generation, people rise up to destroy us, but the Holy One saves us from their hands. I had a professor of psychology as a freshman, as an undergraduate. And it was one of these lecture halls with 200 students, intro psych. And Professor Silverman, I still remember his name. We had to buy his book, which was quite an expensive book. Professor Silverman, one day in class, says to the class, to this auditorium basically, he says, "What's the difference between paranoia and narapoia?" 200 students, not one raises their hand. He asks again. No one raises their hand. Finally, he admits he made up the word narapoia. And he explains. Paranoia is when you think everyone's out to get you, but they're not. Narapoia is when you think they're out to get you, and they are. And I always wonder in Vihi Sha'amda, when we say in every generation they come to destroy us, are we being paranoid or are we being narapoid? And that, of course, can lead to discussions. We come to the 10 plagues. Boy, there's so much room for creativity in the 10 plagues. First of all, if you haven't seen it, it came out, I think, 2 years ago during COVID, the Plagues Project. Google the Plagues Project, and you'll see, I think there are about 20 really smart people who each have something to say, something different to say about the plagues. I particularly like Yehuda Kurtzer, who talked about, who brought in his children and talked about the plagues with them. You can ask people around the table, what would be the worst plague for you? What would be the easiest plague for you? There's lots of room to get kids to do things around this. And of course, also the question is, why were the plagues necessary? Is it that God wanted to, I mean, the Torah tells us that God wanted to show the Egyptians that he was the true God, but he also wanted to show the Jews, who, according to many of our commentators, had fallen away from Jewish life as slaves, were on the 49th level of impurity, 48th level of impurity. And so, you know, the plagues serve a certain function, but they serve a function both against our oppressors as punishment, but also as a sign that the Egyptian gods are powerless next to God. But it was also to convince the Jewish people that their God was a true God and not the Egyptian gods, whom no doubt many of them were already worshiping. It brings us to Dayenu, and I'm sure at most of your tables you sing Dayenu. It's a very familiar tune. And here there's a great opportunity to add in personal Dayenus, to go around the table and to say, you know, if you had to list your Dayenus for this year, what would they be? And we're already towards the end of the Magid section, where we say in every generation, a person needs to view him or herself as if he or she herself or himself had come out of Egypt. B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lira'ot et atzmo ki hu yatsa mitzrayim. And actually, the Rambam Maimonides changes the word a little bit and says leharot et atzmo. You have to show yourself, prove to yourself as if you've come out of Egypt yourself personally. And this ties into a much larger theme, and that is the Jewish view of history. The Jewish view of history is not one that we tell a story about others, but rather that we put ourselves into the shoes of our ancestors. They ate matzah, we eat matzah. They were slaves, we dip something in salt water to feel the tears of slavery. They suffered, we eat bitter herbs. They celebrated as free people, we drink 4 cups of wine and have a big meal. We're not only remembering, it's kind of like a reactivation of history. Elie Wiesel once said that Jews have to see themselves as if they not only were all at Sinai, which the rabbis teach us, that every Jew should view him or herself as if we ourselves were at Mount Sinai when the Torah was given. He said, with his emphasis on the Shoah, that we have to all see ourselves as if we were in Auschwitz. But I don't mean to focus on Auschwitz per se. We have to see ourselves as part of Jewish history, as having been there ourselves, as much as we possibly can. The great American writer, William Faulkner, once wrote, "The past is not dead, it's not even past." Meaning, the past is with us. We know this as individuals. We know that each of us is a product of our past experiences. That when we wake up on a particular day, it's not like we're a tabula rasa. We're not a blank slate. We are the product of what happened to us before in our lives. And so here too, I think that as a people, the Jewish people, as a collective, we are the product of what came before us, what was very challenging and even dreadful, and also the celebratory moments, which are important that we have as well. It doesn't mean we should be stuck in the past. Even though the past is with us, we can't be stuck in the past. And Rabbi Lord Jacobovitz, who actually was the predecessor to Rabbi Sachs as chief rabbi in the UK, Rabbi Lord Jacobovitz said something very beautiful. He said, after the destruction of the temple 2,000 years ago, the Jews didn't despair. They wrote the Mishnah. And he said it even as a critique of Holocaust museums. He said they didn't make a museum of the temple. They wrote the Mishnah. They had a positive response for how to continue Jewish life even without a temple. And similarly, after the Shoah, Jews created the state of Israel. They created a Jewish state. So Jews traditionally have not gotten stuck in the past. We have to keep the past with us. It's with us whether we like it or not. We have to remember it. We have to move forward with the past, taking the past with us, but moving forward, sometimes in new directions. Okay. The Maggid section ends with the beginning of Hallel. And that, of course, offers lots of opportunity for singing. And if I can skip over to the end, and then we'll take questions and comments. At the very end of the Haggadah, really the Haggadah ends at L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. And afterwards, there are some songs, there are some poems and songs that were added later on. And two of the most common ones that we sing are Echad Mi Yodea, who knows one, and Chad Gadia, right? One lamb. There's a great English version of that song, Who Knows One. There's obviously the Hebrew version, Echad Mi Yodea. In our family, we usually sing both the Hebrew and the English. And we go around the table, everybody gets a number. So there's one person who's one, another one is two, another one is three, and who knows one, and that person has to say, I know one. Who knows two, and that person has to say, I know two, and then they have to say, what it is. And it's a lot of fun. If you Google who knows one, Seder song or Haggadah song, you'll be able to hear it. It's a very easy ditty to learn. And it's a lot of fun to go around the table and sing those songs. Same thing with Chad Gadia. You do a round and everybody has a part And again, it creates more participation as well. So I wanted to leave time for questions. So I'm going to first look at the chat, and then people can raise their hands as well. Breaking also has to do with breaking a pattern, not letting your past or present define you. I like that. Very nice, bracha. Sounds like we're not remembering, but membering, right? We're joining in. Excellent. And maybe remembering, joining again. Excellent. Okay. Who has, let me just try to change the, so I can see more of you. How can I see more of you?
So Bracha has her hand up.
Yes, Bracha, please.
Yeah, just a couple more quick things. One is the section that goes as is often described from Shevach, from Genai to Shevach, from
Yes.
Negative stuff like being idol worshippers and slaves to positive stuff like being redeemed and all of that. I actually see the beginning part as Shevach also, because saying that we were idol worshippers means that we were on a path towards Hashem. We were exploring, we were trying to get there, we were searching things out. It's not that we were just mindlessly doing our lives. So to me, even the idol worship is a reaching towards something greater. So that's in terms of that piece. And I also want to mention that Rabbi Berman once taught that the songs at the end of the Seder are not meant to be specifically at the end of the Seder, that they were added to be used anywhere in the Seder, so that you don't have to wait until people are too tired to sing them. You can sprinkle them throughout the Seder. So I thought that was very interesting.
Right.
And also at Hebrew Institute, I once went to a Seder there, and they not only had different people doing the items, the different characters in Haggadah, but also doing sounds with them, like I had water.
Sound of a dog. Yes, I understand. Great. That's terrific.
That really was a very lively way of especially for the last song of the night.
Okay, good. There are a couple of items in the chat now that people have asked. Jenna asks a great question. Why do you think we're required to tell the story of the Exodus, but then during the Seder, we never really tell the full story? In other words, for example, we only say Moshe's name once. The truth is that, one could argue that we should just recite the verses from the book of Exodus about the descent into slavery, etc. But we don't. The Haggadah is a rabbinic creation, and it didn't all happen at once either. Professor Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi's Sidur Haggadah and History, it's called. Puts in different colors when different parts of the Haggadah were put in. So it develops over time. And of course, we can add. I remember in the 1970s and 80s, some of us, I think in this audience will remember, we used to add something for Soviet Jews. Many of us had an empty chair at our table for Soviet Jews. My father, may he rest in peace, used to always read a piece commemorating the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which happened on Erev Pesach, Passover Eve. So Jenna's asking the question, like, why? Why do we think that we do that? I'd like to open that up to you. Does anybody here have any ideas why we would have this version of telling the story as opposed to just reading the verses from the book of Exodus? Any thoughts? Yes, Deborah.
Well, there was an earlier Pardes class about how the food this telling helps us experience the story more than reading the story. Like, right, we go through the food and the bitter and the sweet, and we end after 4 cups of wine with song and praise. And this is an experienced telling, not a text telling.
Great. I like it. I like it. Anybody else? It's definitely supposed to be experiential, not just intellectual. Okay, so now Jan writes, I'm leading a Seder for seniors and independent living, 60 to 90 people. Any suggestions from Magid, Afikomen, or others? Anyone have suggestions about that? I mean, the Afikomen, of course, is meant to replace eating the Paschal lamb. Ever since the temple was destroyed, there's no longer the sacrifice of the Paschal lamb, and we eat the Afikomen instead. I mean, certainly with the people at an independent living facility, I don't know, Jan, if you're going to actually hide the Afikomen or tell them to hide the Afikomen. I see. Now I see you. Okay. Anybody else have any suggestions other than the ones we've made already?
I think just getting people involved as much as possible. I think, bringing a lot of song into it can be really nice. And I see that Judy wrote in the chat, I'm not sure if this was specifically to this question, but accessibility to everyone, no matter their backgrounds. I would say that goes for really any Seder. So sounds like an exciting opportunity.
Mm-hmm. I would imagine you can ask them to, if it's 60 to 90 people, you can't ask everybody. But it could be that there are certain people who could relate something about a special Seder they attended. And I'm sure that that would add a lot to the conversation. Bracha?
Going back to the previous question about not completing the story, not having the complete story in there, maybe it's on the one hand meant to engage everyone in mentioning different aspects that might not have been mentioned. And also maybe it's to tell us that the story is not yet finished, that we have a part in continuing that story.
Good, good. I see what Cindy wrote in terms of why we don't tell the story. We tell the story about peoplehood, and the actual Egypt piece is one moment in that story. We do tell pieces of that, but we also have to zoom out and see how this fits into context, because then we can see ourselves and our context in the experience. Okay, nice. Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, so I'd like to wish everybody a meaningful Seder. Again, I come back to preparation. Try to get people to prepare in advance, and it can be as simple as a picture or a quote or an anecdote, or it could be, a commentary on some piece of the Seder, some piece of the Haggadah. And I'm wishing you all a meaningful Seder and a wonderful holiday. And we should all be liberated from the things we need to be liberated from. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you so
Amen.
much,
Thank
you.
Bernstein. Thank you all for coming. I'll be sending out a follow-up email after this class. And to the question about when the recording will be available, my hope is that it will be available by the end of the week. We're really going to try and get that out there for you guys. So thank you all so much, and Chag Kasher V'Sameach.